Barney said to me one day, "How old are you?" And I said, "I'll soon be 10. He said, "You'll soon have to learn to milk."
Well, everybody on Cockatoo Valley Road milked cows, all by hand, you know, up around the 20 mark, I suppose. They all reared families and...
It's only a hobby. If you're working at what you like, it can be a hobby. And if the hobby makes money...
Tom Clifford told me, he said, worst thing I ever pulled out of a can of cream one day was a chook. He'd been having a drink and it fell in. Chook!
All mud and girls milking them, share farmers. Shocking. Mud up to their backsides. The ones that I admire for what they did are the wives, the farmers' wives.
For the first 40 years of European settlement, the dairy industry was a very small one. A cottage industry. Some people milked a house cow if they had an acre or two. Every village had a common, a piece of land set aside for public or common use. A small annual fee was charged. Grazing a cow on the common was a practice which endured in some places till the 1960s. Butter was made by settling milk in shallow dishes or trays overnight, allowing the cream to float to the top where it was skimmed off. The cream was then churned into butter, a process not conducive to production on an industrial scale. Experiments in exporting butter to England, salted in barrels, met with some success. However, it was the introduction of a number of technological developments during the 1880s and 1890s that enabled the industry to expand rapidly and establish itself on a commercial basis. The first and most important development was the introduction of refrigeration. This resulted in the first successful shipment of chilled butter, which arrived in England in January 1881 aboard the steamship Protos. An equally important development was the invention in Sweden of the mechanical cream separator, without which butter could not be produced on an industrial scale. Other advances were to follow, including improved pasture species and eventually superphosphate and trace elements. The opening of this virtually unlimited overseas market for butter saw a great expansion of the industry throughout the 1880s and 90s. Change was rapid. With most transport limited to horse and cart, factories needed to be close to the source of production, and many sprang up throughout what is now the Glenelg Shire. Merino, Tirrandarra, Cape Bridgewater, Drick, Conda, Casterton and Portland. Finally, and well after the others, the Haywood Cheese Factory was opened in 1939. Yannery at Tirrandarra appears to have been one of the very first cheese and butter factories in the district. Established by Donald MacLeod in the late 1880s, a report at the time describes very advanced methods used on farm. He used a roller to clear the thick tea tree scrub which covered most of the property, rather than hand clearing, and was the first Victorian farmer to use silage on a large scale, which was stored in stone-lined pits. He was one of the first to sink a bore for a constant supply of cool, clear water. Cheese and butter were made from milk sourced not only from his 100 Ayrshire cows, but from other farmers in the district. Still lying among the ruins today is an old separator pedestal manufactured by J. Bartram and Son of Melbourne. Beginning in the late 1880s, Bartrams became exporters of butter, as well as establishing themselves as importers and agents for all types of machinery and fittings required by the dairy farmer and butter factory, including buckets, cans, calf feeders, cream coolers, kegs, butter making machinery, horseworks, steam engines and boilers, and of course the mighty Alfa Laval cream separators, which had revolutionised the industry. Cape Bridgewater was one of the first areas settled in the Shire due to it being only very lightly timbered. In 1836, Edward Henty described the Cape as being 3,000 acres of fine cheap land, very lightly timbered and well covered with kangaroo grass. By the 1840s, the area had been surveyed into farms of 1 to 200 acres. The cooperative Bridgewater Butter Factory was opened for business in 1892. The factory was situated on Newton's Lane at Lower Cape Bridgewater. This wonderful old photo shows farmers posing for the camera after delivering their cream. In the late 1890s, one of the larger Bridgewater landowners, John Doyle, following a disagreement with factory management, established his own factory on the Cape, on the property now known as Cape House. 100 cows were hand-milked by Doyle's 4 sons. The old stone dairy where the cream was separated and butter churned by steam engine still exists. A ledger book from the period is still owned by the family.
It's interesting to note here when they had their own butter factory where they sold some of the butter.
Butter sold in Melbourne
1902.
504 pounds of butter for £20.15.
Butter exported to London in 1905, a total of 2,240 pounds, which is about a tonne. Gives the amounts, and they've had an advance of £86 for the tonne of butter. I guess they get a dividend after that, or a second payment.
In the early days, stock that were run near the coast were prone to what was called coast disease, which was eventually diagnosed as a lack of cobalt and copper. To alleviate this problem, cattle especially had to be spelled away. To this end, many farmers on the coast owned blocks inland. A cooperative butter factory was established at Drick in 1894 with 11 farmer shareholders. It struggled on till 1906 before closing, due mainly to a lack of reliable cream supply.
And after the factory closed, they bought separator over at the old property, and they'd separate and put the cream down a little canopy over the top of a spring, and they'd keep it down there to try and keep it cool. Then it was picked up by a little carry that went, I think he had a business between Dartmoor and Hayward. About once a week it was picked up and sent to Melbourne.
Be in very good order by the time we got to Melbourne, would it?
No, Uncle Glenn told me it was usually second grade. Yes, it was used for pastry making or something. I never made butter out of it.
The Merino area was first settled by the Hentys in 1837, it being prime wool growing country. To take advantage of the dairy boom beginning in the early 1880s, a cooperative butter factory was formed in 1885. It was managed by Alexander McLeod, brother of Donald McLeod, who was developing Yannery Butter Factory at Tirrandarra at the same time. McLeod had married Caroline Henty, one of Francis Henty's 3 daughters. In 1908, the old Merino Downs estate was divided into 3, being named Merino Downs, Wertwert Court and Talisker. On Wertwert Court, 13 shared dairy farms were established, each having a house, dairy and piggery. 12 farms were set up on Talisker Estate. In 1901, a new 2-storey timber factory was built to the latest design. The co-op struggled on till 1910, when it was taken over and later purchased by J.E. Hanbury and Son, who continually improved and upgraded the factory. Frank Rogers' father was one of the share farmers on Talisker, but unfortunately died when Frank was just 14, leaving Frank, 2 sisters and mother to carry on the farm in the style of the period.
The amount of land they had, it just wasn't quite enough, but they were milking by hand in those days, and they didn't have milking plants or anything like that. We were never hungry, but we never had any money.
Taliska was taken over for a soldier settlement scheme following World War II. Frank, being a returned serviceman, was able to obtain the property his family had previously share farmed before the war.
I got it as a soldier settlement block, and I'm still there. It's 150 acres, and I started off milking 55 cows, but then I supered. I put in a dam for irrigation, and I irrigated, and I got up to 85 cows I milked, was the most I milked.
A soldier settlement area was established on nearby Struan Estate in 1919. This was renamed Passchendaele after the battle in Belgium in 1917. Passchendaele comprised 39 blocks, varying in size from 80 to 250 acres. Jake Boyd was born in 1917 and remembers accompanying the driver of the horse team collecting cream from Wertwert Court in 1930.
Oh, some of them had 100 cows on Wertwert, some of the big farms. All mud and girls milking them, share farmers. Shocking. Mud up to their backsides. God. No roads at all, just mud heaps. They had a 4-in-hand big wagon, and I used to go with Tom Emmett on a Saturday morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. I was a boy, opening the gaps, wire gaps everywhere. Mud, M-U-D.
So 4-in-hand was a 4-horse team, was it?
Yeah. They'd pull two decks of cream, you see. One on the top deck and another layer on the... Took good horses to pull it too. Half drafts they were. But there was a couple of drivers, Tom Emmett and Lucy Guthridge. Had 2 wagons going, one Talisker and one out Wertwert, getting it out of the mud. There was no roads then, just mud tracks. There were 32 gaps on bloody Wertwert alone. Barbed wire gaps, with the droppers on wire roller.
Instead of gates?
Yeah, no gates. It was all made up out of wire, barbed wire, across the gaps.
Marks are still there, and that's where the cream cart come down. It used to come down the hill, but he used to get the wheels down about 2 feet. He had a tractor, and the wheels went down about 2 feet, and the horses went in between us.
New health regulations introduced in the 1920s required all dairy factories to be built of brick and concrete, replacing the older timber structures. Hanbury's replaced their Merino factory with a new brick building located on the Merino-Coleraine Road, at the same time installing all the latest equipment, including a 1-ton butter churn, all powered by a Babcock boiler burning 16 tonnes of wood a day. Opening day in 1933 was a grand affair. In the late 1940s, Hanbury's sold their Merino and Casterton factories to British United Dairies. This company continued to modernise and upgrade the plant, including a fleet of the latest Bedford trucks.
Not too many Bedfords pulled bloody trailers. Weak bastards have seen pommy trucks.
British United Dairies altered the plant for the production of milk powder, which enabled farmers to market whole milk. This resulted in farmers dispensing with pig raising, as they were no longer required to utilise the skim milk. A large area of the Conda Swamp was drained during the late 1800s, and small blocks were thrown open for selection. It was said that the ground was so fertile that it would carry a cow to the acre. The Excelsior Cheese Company built a factory and exported cheese as far away as London. Later, local dairymen formed a cooperative butter factory, which opened for business in a timber building in 1901. 2 creameries operated by the butter factory were strategically sited to enable skim milk to be returned to the farms for pig raising and the cream brought to the butter factory. The present brick building began operations in 1929. Jim Robertson began as a factory hand and relief driver in 1952.
About 15 of us there, usually in the springtime, up to, say, about the end of August till December, until it started to slacken off, and that was 3 times a week, the collection, wasn't it then? Well, yeah, Monday, Wednesday and Friday used to be Wallasdale and Ebsworth, and Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday used to be Branxholme and
Milltown and the far out ones.
In 1954, Ray Dennett and his brother Bob won the contract to pick up milk and cream from farms and deliver it to the factory.
Branxholme used to be the pain because they had a common, and I think they used to have to pay so much a cow to have the cows run on the common.
$5 a year.
And I'd run around Branxholme picking up a little billy of cream here at every house.
Yeah,
one bloke, I won't mention his name. Oh, I could, I suppose. They're Bob and Lucy White. They used to milk 10 cows and run them on the common. 10 cows. And he'd go down with a couple of dogs and he'd bring these cows up and milk them at his house and then take them back down on the common.
I picked this fellow Adamson up. He was a 60, 70 cow dairy, about 4 cans of cream, and I'd graded the cream, and Tom Clifford, the manager, graded the cream, and we both passed it as choices. Tipped it, and I got 14 rats out of 1 can. And had a fellow working with me, and we had the government inspector happened to be there that day. Well, had about 2,000 pounds of cream in the big vat, and if you got caught with the government inspector, that was pull the plug that went down the drain. And this fella kept saying, "A big rat, Jim, big rat." And I had trouble shutting him up. Anyway, I got him shut up and had the vat full, got out of the way, got the big hose and washed them off down the big drain. But, yeah, well, great. There was nothing wrong with the cream. The rats couldn't have been in it long, only overnight probably.
In 1892, the Glenelg and Wannon butter and cheese factory was set up at Sandford, 2 miles south of Casterton. Creameries were set up strategically to separate the cream by use of a steam engine driving a large separator. Farmers brought their milk in cans to be separated into cream and skimmed milk. They sold the cream to the factory and took the skim milk home to feed the pigs. The creamery was typically 2 stories high, so that carts could drive underneath where the cans could be hauled to the top story by block and tackle, as seen on the left of the photo. Here the milk was fed by gravity into the separator. 2 or more creameries may have supplied the one factory. Creameries fell out of favour when small hand-operated separators were introduced and the job was done on farm. J.E. Handbury and Sons, who already owned the Merino factory, bought the Casterton business in 1927. In 1936 they demolished the old factory and built a new modern brick premises in Macpherson Street, which still stands today. Originally designed for butter production, a drying plant for powdered milk production was included in the early 50s. As town populations increased, fresh milk vendors established milk grounds, independent of the factories. This grand old photo was taken in Casterton in 1922, when milk was delivered by the billy can, filled from a larger container on the cart. Not a lot had changed by the early 1940s, when Rolly Cooper was helping with deliveries.
4 milk vendors in Casterton when I was a boy, and that still going to school during the war years. Pretty lively horses mainly, and we'd pull up in front of the house and you'd go round the back and turn the tap on, and you'd remember that they usually get 2 pints or 3 pints or what have you, and you turn the tap on at the back of the cart and stick about 3 or 4 pints in your billy and run in and holler out "milk go," and it didn't matter if somebody didn't open the door and so on. There'd be a receptacle on the front veranda and that here. and you could tell by the money and what they wanted, and that a penny halfpenny for a pint, and I think it was threepence or something for a quart, and most of your dealing was in the coppers, pennies and halfpennies and that sort of thing. Yeah.
The Portland Cooperative Butter Factory was not established till 1912. Prior to that, we can only assume that supply was only sufficient to satisfy the town. Excess may have been railed to Hamilton Butter Factory, which was opened in 1892. Portland's butter factory's eventual establishment may have been precipitated by the opening up of the Cashmore heathlands. This heath country had hitherto been considered too poor for farming. However, a government draining scheme was commenced in 1908 to relieve the area of its water and bring it into production. The Wattle Hill Creek was widened and deepened to take the additional flow. The first selectors on Cashmore included the Kerrs, Taylors, Wilmots and Thompsons. Good summer grazing meant it was very wet in winter.
The worst problems were when it was very wet and cold, and the cattle didn't like to go out in the paddocks too much. They'd rather stay in the shelter if it got really cold and wet in August. And August was always our worst month really in the dairying, because the cows were all just freshly in, and the weather was usually at its worst. So we were always pleased when August was over.
The Portland factory was sited at the corner of Townsend and Percy Streets, and part of it still stands, disguised as the Portland Dive Shop. Originally set up as a butter factory, it later bottled cream and milk for the domestic market. A skim milk powder drying facility was added in the 1950s. Don Rivet worked there in various capacities for 30 years, beginning as a driver in 1952. It was a period when the cream truck supplied great support for the farmer and his wife.
We used to cart meat, bread, butter out to the farms. We used to take, one day a week we took our butter out. We used to go to Quinlivan's Bakery, was in Julia Street. McPherson's was on the corner, the other baker shop. And then there was Bell's Bakery. There was Halliday's Butchers. We used to take meat from there. And we'd pick it up and take it in, put it in sack it up in the cabin. It's all wrapped, all parcelled up. And then we'd take it out in the morning. And we'd deliver that when we picked up their cream. We did that for years, till in the finish the mail cart started taking it, which was a blessing in disguise for us. But it was a good way of people getting their stuff 3 days a week.
Driving the cream pickup truck could certainly have its challenges.
Yeah, go to Cosy Cameron's, they'd have 16 10-gallon cans of cream, and you'd have to carry them half a chain, mud that deep, and there'd never be anyone around there to give you a lift.
Harry Baker was the one out here at the back of Brent Conda. He'd wait and you had the last can on. Don't lift them by yourself, boy. They're too heavy for one. But you'd have the last one on before he'd come round the corner and tell you. Yeah. Poor, he was a good bloke, but he never helped you put the can on.
Then another place you used to go to, that was on that run. He'd have the calves that begin drinking skim milk straight out of the separator.
Yeah.
And the chooks would be in sitting on the edge of the can. She was rough. But
Tom's livid Tom, he said, worst thing I ever pulled out of a can of cream one day was a chook. He'd been having a drink and it fell in. A chook.
All that stuff is, once that was there, you're
any livestock
supposed to go.
Open slather for the livestock.
One time I used to pick up kids and take them to school with me. Take them up to the school at Grey West. So some of those families are still living in the district.
The Black River Flats in the Haywood area are ideal dairying country. Originally only lightly covered with heath and tea tree, with scattered clumps of white gum, it was easily cleared by the pioneers. a host of small dairy farms grew up around the town. The flats grew green feed well into the summer, but they could be very, very wet in winter.
I grew up in a dairy farm near Haywood, daughter of George and Mary Parry. We came here in 1946 just in time for the worst floods in memory. The mud was incredible. The cows literally had to drag their udders through the mud to be milked. One memory I always have is just here, 2 hay bales floating past with 2 snakes on board.
Surprisingly, Haywood did not have its own butter factory, cream being sent to either Portland or Hamilton by rail, till the Haywood cheese factory opened in 1939, taking whole milk. That story has already been told in the DVD Haywood Cheese, an oral history on film. Farms varied considerably in size. Since the manufacture of butter commenced on an industrial scale in the 1880s, there have been a few larger operators milking up to 100 cows. But by far the largest number of dairies was small, often very small. The Conda swamp drainage scheme was an example.
And all the blokes that had worked on the drain, because all dug out by a shovel and wheelbarrow, and all the ones that had worked on it, they owed them a bit of money, so they allowed them to buy, I think,
7 and 10 acre blocks.
From 7 to 10 acres, yes.
And Wallasdale, on the side of the hill, they were only half chain roads because they were saving ground.
Didn't want to waste ground with a road, then you wanted a carriageway, and that's what happened to these farms. And some made money, they milked 8, 10, 12, 15 cows, and they reared a family on that. Now you need 300 cows. You don't make a profit.
The ones that made money, they gradually bought the others out.
Yeah, and the other fellow that didn't work so hard, he'd pay.
I used to milk 10, 12, the factory and the place I lived out there. The factory and the place I lived out there. And I only had, what, about 9 acres, I reckon.
Yeah, you were there when we went there first, in 1954.
Nearly everybody had a house cow, and then they built up and milked maybe 8, 9, 10. Until they'd done something else. They'd have a few ewes and lambs, but it was ready money. It paid the store bill.
My mother was a good cook with rabbits, and she could cook rabbits, and we could catch them too. There were plenty of rabbits around, and well, that's how most of us lived. You know, we lived off the land, and we grew our own vegetables. There's no got the old spade into the garden and dug that and so forth.
In the early days, land clearing was labour intensive and slow. Dairy farming gave the greatest return per acre of cleared land. It was an industry where women and children could assist with their labour, which in many cases was all that made ends meet. One government inquiry in the 1920s described it as white slavery, though few of the participants would have seen it as that.
Well, my first memories were in the 1940s when we had about 12 dairy cows and we milked them by hand. There was my brother and I and Mum and Dad, we just milked some each day.
I used to have to walk to school, and about, I suppose, in 3 k's it was through the bush, and milk cows at night time, and I don't remember milking them in the morning, but at night time I did, by hand.
Yes, I milked 6 cows before I went to school. By that time I was 12, 13, jumped on the pony, and young brother would have the pony ready, get a bit of cold porridge for breakfast, jump on the pony, 3 miles to the school at Drick, and back home again. Yeah. We might add 5 minutes in the afternoon, and we could have a bit of a kick of the footy, otherwise we'll chop some wood and milk some cows again.
Bores with electric pumps supplied plentiful water to the dairies, but it wasn't always safe. In earlier times, they who had a creek running through the property were fortunate, though these could dry up in summer. Wells sunk down to the water table in a low point of the farm were the norm. Huon Buglehole's ancestors came to Garay West from Bridgewater in the 1860s.
Every farm in the first 5 in the area selected and built their house on the higher type ground, but always next to a flat area, because it was always easier to put a well down and get water on the flat country, or where the two grounds met is the best position.
Yeah, I dug a well or two, and I remember digging them. We'd buy 8 foot lengths of 8 by 1.5 timber, and we'd cut them in half and cut the piece out of the end so they'd interlock, and you'd start digging the well and you'd put the 4 boards around, and as you dug they dropped down, then you put another board on top, and as you dug it out you would keep putting until we got right down to water, and then we'd dig as far as we could, bucket it out and put a rope on the bucket, and the bloke down the bottom would keep filling it with mud, and the more we could get down the more supply we'd have, or more storage we'd have. But we'd only go about, at the most, 10 feet I suppose.
In the pioneering era, water might be drawn from a well by bucket or old kangaroo pump. Windmills with a galvanised iron tank for storage came later.
I had to drag water from the mill up there by horse and sledge. You come along and pull in there, 244 open top drums, and you had to be careful that you had enough water to do the next milking. It didn't matter how busy you were, you had to go, and it was time consuming. At the time you caught the horse and filled the 2 drums and dragged him down there, the best part of an hour. So you just had to make sure that you had enough water to do the milking on.
The sandy soils of Cape Bridgewater held very little surface water. Reliance was on wells, which could dry up in drought years. In 1905, John Doyle gained permission, and for a fee of 16 shillings per annum, was permitted to water his cows at the spring-fed rock pools below the cliffs on the west coast of Cape Bridgewater. A stone walkway was built down the cliff, which has only disintegrated in recent years. Farms supplying cream to butter factories separated the skim milk from the cream. The skim milk was utilised to feed calves and pigs. The rule of thumb was 1 cow per sow. Originally, calves were bucket fed. Teaching calves to drink out of a bucket could be challenging.
You had to use your finger that's in the calf's mouth to get the sort of interpreted as a teat from a cow, but then as soon as you took the finger away they wouldn't suck.
This was a can feeder developed by my dad. Probably thought about it for a while after feeding calves by hand with a bucket. Just holes drilled into the side of the can, 10 teats. Take it to wherever you wanted to feed your calves. Take your milk with you, put the milk in the top, calves just come in and feed. Simple, effective, very good.
I went to a field day one day and saw a crate that had been made, and with a teat, would just run down the teat, and if we get the calf to drink out of that teat, it was a very simple operation. And once they start to drink out of the teat, they'd then be able to suck it out of a bucket themselves.
Bull calves were sold, and heifer calves raised as replacements for older cows being culled. Originally, all cows were named, sometimes over 100 of them.
We named them in families really. A cow whose name started with R, all its descendants would be heifers starting with R, so that kept the herd more organised, we thought, so every cow, its descendants had the same letter to start its name. But some people just had numbers, I think, and just had ear tags with numbers, but we always had names.
In the early days, cows were often milked in the open, sometimes where they stood, but more often in a bale to prevent them wandering off. The old bark-roofed cowshed must have been a common sight during the pioneering era.
Stringy bark. You used to get the bark off the trees, and that's what the roof and the walls were made up out of. And to do that, the old man used to, when he was cutting posts, he'd cut the bark off and it'd come off in one slab and it'd be the same shape as the tree. And what he'd do then, he'd open up as much as he could and put a couple of sticks in it to hold it there, and then he'd light up a couple of tussocks and he'd lay the bark on top of the tussocks, and that'd open the bark out flat, and he'd lay a couple of posts on it. Next morning you'd have a good part for a roof or for a wall for the shed.
This photo shows a cowshed built entirely of split timber for frame, walls, floor and roof. This was long before the delicate term dairy came into common use, and concerns about hygiene were still well in the future. The walk-through cowshed with a remotely opening door was an innovation of the 1920s and 30s. When milking machines were introduced, health regulators insisted that there be concrete floors and an airspace or breezeway between the milking area and the engine room and separating room. Dairy design standardised in this form for the next 30 years, and many examples can still be seen along roadsides today. The first successful milking machines operating on the vacuum system were invented in Scotland in the late 1800s. Among the extensive display of dairying memorabilia at the Allansford Cheese World Museum is an early model bucket milker dating from 1905.
This is the earliest type of milking machine in Australia that actually worked properly. Up until then they'd had a few other models. They didn't really work successfully, and they were worried about damaging the cows, their udders and their teats. And this became 1902. It started off from Scotland. It was imported into Australia by Bartram and Sons. The earlier model of this did not have the same pulsator system that's operating on this one, and that, as it moves backwards and forwards because of the suction, would operate an on-off sucking movement, which was more like a calf sucking the mother's teat on the udder, and that was much more effective. Lawrence and Kennedy from Scotland made the original one. This one is called the LKG, and the G came into existence because Alexander Gillies from Tirang, just up the road here, he improved it so much that it became a much more workable proposition. The claw here, Alexander Gillies also invented this, and that came into existence in 1905, and as you can see it hasn't changed much even to the present day. In the end of that there's a little hole, a pinhole, which releases the suction as the pulsator goes backwards and forwards, and it's not a constant suction like it used to be originally. Now this machine is steam operated. At the back here there's a little pipe that went up to an overhead line which had steam going through it. That created a vacuum which held this top on and also gave you the suction for the action for the milking. The bucket system operated for quite a while, and then later on Bartram's introduced the overhead milking system and did away with the buckets. That would hold enough for a couple of cows.
Even though the first milking machines date from the early 1900s, it was not until the mid to late 1930s that they became a common sight in district cowsheds.
Buglehole Farm was the first to get machines in the mid-1930s. They had a Warren Farmer bucket plant, which was motorised by an engine and a vacuum pump. The milk would come into a bucket between the cows, and then that bucket of milk would then have to be carried to the milk room and put up into a vat. Then that would come down into the actual separator and then be separated into cream. It was a lot easier than doing it by milking by hand, but still a fair bit of hand work to be done. But then when the newer type machines come in where the milk went down a pipe into the vats, made a lot easier.
The biggest change, I think, in the dairying in my time anyway, from having to milk by hand, which was a very slow, tedious process, to being able to milk by machine was just an enormous difference, and it helped so much in the number of cows that you could have in your dairy.
The next major change for the dairy farmer was the introduction of mains electricity.
Yes, we had no SEC power until about 1964, I think. I think we were the last place in Victoria to get power here. And it made an enormous difference. Be able to switch a light on and one thing and another. I had a pressure light that I used to hang up on the front here if we got caught late at night. When I was younger, I didn't mind getting late and milking in the dark, but as I got older, no way. So I used to stay away from sport and I'd milk. But when we got the power, we put it down here. It made a big difference, all the difference in the world.
The next major change was the herringbone design of dairy, which appeared in the early 1960s.
We're looking at the first herringbone dairy built in this district by Doug Quayle, and after that the Phillips family built theirs, and then the Ubigang family built theirs, and then the system really exploded where all dairies started to switch to a herringbone configuration. Our milking time was probably cut in half easily, and our labour time was cut way down. It was incredible what really happened. We were able to cut in half and milk a lot more cows in that same period of time. We were all starting to milk 100 cows instead of 30 or 40 cows.
Some of the very first herringbone sheds had the cows walk up a ramp rather than have a pit for the milker to work in. One of these very early four-a-side sheds is still operated successfully by Rodney and Jill Dent near Haywood. Some modern herringbones have since grown to more than 20 a side. The rotary or turnstile design of dairy was introduced from New Zealand in the early 1980s. More capital intensive, it has allowed for even greater numbers of cows to be milked with a given labour force. The Fife brothers, Max and John, have been involved in all the changes and were the first in the Shire to build a turnstile shed.
When we first started, it was 4 cows in a walk-through shed, 30 cows only, and we used to spend possibly an hour and a half milking those in the morning. And then as each farm came along, we then had to just keep it at 2 hours. We didn't want to go to 3 or 4 hours working in the sheds. We'd heard people getting up and working for 4 hours, but most people seemed to be around about the 2 hours in the shed. So that's where progress came along. You went from 4 cows walk through to 8 cows walk through. Then you went to a 9 or 10 cow herringbone, and then you finished up with 15 cows in the same herringbone by turning them round on the angle. And then when that time for those 300 cows pushed out to 2.5, 3 hours, that's when we went up to the turnstile. That got the timing back to within 2 hours, and we could quite easily milk the 400 cows in 2 hours. Yeah, that was fine.
Since the 1920s, government-appointed herd testers had been calling at farms monthly to test butterfat production. This was probably the single most important service provided to the dairy farmer in determining the best performing cows in the herd. Next came the dairy extension officers, who fostered new methods and ideas.
When I was young, the cows were just put in a paddock and looked after themselves more or less. It was only when the agriculture department come along and Jack Green that we realised what you could really do.
And by that you mean what?
Oh, he'd have field days and discussion groups and explain how you could breed better cows and produce better grass and have shelter belts and have strip grazing and all those sort of things.
The Haywood Artificial Breeders Co-op began in 1960. Being able to source genetics from the best bulls in the state was to have a considerable impact on dairy production in the district. Jock Mitchell was there from the beginning and eventually took the business over. He was a busy man.
Jack Green headed the dairy supervisors in Victoria. he was going through his books and he wondered why the Hayward area, with the herd tested and so, were always top of the list. And he looked at everything. Then one day he looked at what bulls we were used here and so forth, and he realised it was the AI that was putting us on top. Now, a lot of centres, to get customers, would use cheap bulls, $2 a dose or something like that, which was all right for the pocket. And I did it too here, when, in rare occasions, when butterfat was that low, and farmers would drop us at the herd testing, and the AI were the first two things they dropped when the butterfat prices fell. And Jack Green looked at all these things and he found out it was the bulls that we were using. And as I said, I would not use cheap bulls or rubbishy stuff. We used the top of the bracket. And some guys never even picked a bull. They left it to me. And they're the guys that had the top herds today. And that's all it was using good stuff.
I'd say it went up about 25% after 2 or 3 years, when the heifers that had been born to artificial insemination started producing. Yes, it's quite a big lift in production.
Where cows were doing 20, 22 litres were at the tops, they're now doing 40 litres at the tops. And that's just through artificial breeding or genetic breeding and farmer management of the way they feed their stock.
The feeding regime of the modern dairy cow is in stark contrast to the pioneering era of the 1800s, when cows were grazed on native pasture.
From what my father tells me, that he can recall when all this country was semi-open, they could see through kangaroos through the countryside. When he was a boy, it had what they call wallaby grass and kangaroo grass, which is all native grass, and they just sort of, the cattle would forage on those grasses, and that was enough to give some milk. Mightn't have got much milk, but they were happy in those days to do it like that until better pastures came along and better fertilisers. They were using blood and bone dust to help promote growth, and then those apparently.
On Dad's old home, only a half a mile across there, his parents, well, Dad was one of the younger ones of the family. There was 11 in the family, and they milked cows by hand over there. And it was native pasture, of course. There was no super used then. And I asked Dad what was the best month. He said, oh, December, he said, when the trefoil came up. It was a little yellow one. I had it over here too one year, where the wet summer, and up it came from nowhere.
Gradually, land was cultivated and European grasses introduced. As the bulk of feed grew in spring, grass had to be conserved for drier months of the year. Traditionally, this was done by making hay. For hundreds of years, grass was cut with sickle or a scythe. Then came the horse-drawn finger mower. It was all labour-intensive work.
The Talisker estate, they cut that. They had 5 workers on the estate, and they cut the hay and they raked the hay, but we had to cart it in. Of course, it was a sledge and a horse and a pitchfork, and that's what we had. And we used to go, well, first of all, we used to have, they'd rake it and then we'd stook it into heaps. We'd about 5 rakes to stook, and then we'd come along, they'd have to stop there for about a week or a fortnight to dry out, and then we'd cart it in and we'd make stacks, hay stacks. Yeah, it's good how to make a haystack, how you have to bind it and so forth, and it's all taught down. And we had one bloke come from Bungaroo, he was an Irishman, Bungaroo was Irish, and he had trouble with the haystack. He said, for God's sake, don't tell them Don't tell him I come from Bungaree, will you? And his name was Paddy Ryan.
The first lot of hay that I remember being made with the stationary press was over at my uncle's paddock over there. It took about 7 or 8 men to work the thing. You had to sweep the hay up by horse sweep, and 2 pulling it apart for the chap to feed it in, and 2 tying, and if you were lucky you might have somebody to take the bales away out of your way and stack them up. But it was dusty and hot and terrible. And 8 blokes be working for a week, and they used to take it in turn. I'd have a bit and he'd have a bit and somebody else, and by the time you finished up you only had about 300 bales and you'd worked for 10 days probably. But it was handy for the winter because the winters were a bit tight then. But then later on when the balers come around, instead of doing 300 you do 3,000. Then there was a problem with carting them in, of course they're scattered all over the place. Yeah.
In advent of having the rotary mowers, you cut a lot of grass in a short time, and with the round rollers you'd be able to roll it up and not affected by rain. You could bring it in, there was no labour required at all apart from a tractor driver.
Oh, it made it easy. Yeah. You could cart in the evening if you wanted to, and you weren't under pressure, you didn't have any men working for you or anything. And the big paddock, you'd have a dump up one end and one on the other, and so just a temporary fence around it.
Buglehole Farm was the first farm in the area to have silage. They started off by just cutting it with the finger mower, and with a buck rake they'd push it into heaps and then bring it into the actual silage heap. But it's still hard work to get out. It had to be cut with an axe and pulled out with a pitchfork, which was very hard work. Did that for several years until your back gave out.
It was not till the harvesting and feeding out of silage became fully mechanised that it gained wider acceptance. Before the invention of superphosphate, the old European farmers knew the value of fertiliser produced on farm. However, it was rarely practiced in Australia. A dairy farmer on Oakbank, north of Haywood, appears to have been one of the exceptions.
At Oakbank, Victoria, animal manure is stored in a tank and made into liquid manure. Taken by tank and spread over the pastures, this farmer's primitive method gets good results in improved pastures.
Well, superphosphates come in the district around 1922. Before that they were using bone dust and blood and bone, and perhaps even animal fertiliser to try and get the paddocks fertile. And when it first started it was just superphosphate. They'd cut a bag out and put it over their shoulders and just spread it by hand, because in those days there wasn't that much cleared anyway, so it took a while. But some would reckon there was direct drop spreaders for a start. But no, they used to be pulled with a horse, with a chain from the wheel, and then the spinning rotor would throw it out. And if you're going through slow conditions, it wouldn't throw far enough, because the wheels weren't turning quick enough.
The land wasn't very productive then. They hadn't used super for any great length of time. But then of course the war came when there was no super. Then after that they started using bag to the acre. That was the usual thing. Big bag, 180 pound. Put out by the old horse and spreader too to start with. Then the truck started and super spreading was no problem at all. Yes. It improved each year, but the winters were tight then. If you got a frost it burnt the grass, and it was pretty slow, it didn't grow through the winter. But it's different now with potash and copper and stuff like that. Frost doesn't seem to hurt, just grows through the winter as well.
A good dog was a great asset on a farm.
That dog could do things that I did not know that he was doing until he was doing it. remember one time went to get the drench gun to go and drench the calves. Where's the dog? Just when you want him, he's not here. Looked up, he had those calves at the gate ready for me to drench the calves. He knew as soon as I got the drench gun what was going to be done. And I'd sometimes go out to get the cows even at night to bring a cow and there's perhaps calving or even that calved, because it would always had a dog around the cows. They didn't worry too much about it. As long as that dog that's happy, the dog would actually push the calf with his nose to try and get it down to the cow yard to get perhaps a bottle of milk for at night. He knew what his job was. And even when the vet was there, even when the artificial inseminator was there, he'd know that what time he'd arrive and he'd be down there to help the inseminator get the cows into the yard inseminated.
The draft horses used to run with the cows and that down there, and we had a horse paddock for the hacks and the ponies and the cart horses and whatever. We could send the dog down among the dairy cows to bring the horses back. You just carry the winkers out and send Mickey down around when he saw you with the winkers and that, he knew to bring the draft horses up. You could send him down here.
Yeah, they all had their pecking order. Somebody would be first in the gate, first through the shed, and others would always be the last.
In our case, the cows were milked, and in the daytime they went to a property across the road, and every time that you let them out to go across the road, the same cow would lead off, and coming home at night the same thing had happened. The same cow would lead off and the last cow would be nearly the same one every time. And even in the milking process, the same ones had come into the bale first, and they'd come in order. You could nearly trust them to know which order to maintain.
And when you we didn't dry off our cows all at once, because they'd calved at different over perhaps 2 or 3 months, so they'd be put out again earlier. And if you put out a batch of cows and that very next milking, they were confused, because the leaders perhaps were put out, the ones would go in the bale first in the next 2 or 3 runs, even the cow that was milked last. Suddenly someone else was to be milked last, and they couldn't, just for a start, they really couldn't work themselves out. But after a few milkings they were right again, but yes.
With milk prices largely underpinned by international markets, there had always been fluctuations in farm profitability, the greatest downturn being the economic depression of the early 1930s, when prices more than halved. The boom years following World War II, along with increased land development, resulted in greater herd sizes and the threat of oversupply. One of the remedies thought up by the Balti Coalition government was the school milk program, delivered in half-pint bottles. The 1970s saw a major change in the industry, resulting in a third of Victorian dairy farmers selling out or changing to other forms of agriculture. There were 2 major reasons for this. One was a shift to bulk milk handling, requiring refrigerated vats on farm, as well as providing access for the milk tanker, an expense which some didn't care to take on.
So I said to my wife, if ever I'm going to get out of milking cows, now's the time. So that's what I did. I sold them and I never looked back. It's the best thing I've done.
For those who stayed in the industry, bulk milk had distinct advantages.
I mean, we used to have to wash, possibly we were on maybe 40 cans a day, 50 cans a day, go up, travel 2 mile, pick up the cans, bring them back, wash them. Just couldn't get a bulk milk tank in quick enough at that time. So, and that was fine. That was just a progression. More time to work on the farm. That was fine, which made it. I mean, anyone that can work out how many hours you spent carting cans and washing cans would. And then all of a sudden you didn't have to do it. That was good.
Australia's major market for butter was lost when Britain joined the European Economic Community in 1973. Milk prices were depressed and even domestic consumption of whole milk was falling. To counter these changes, a number of marketing initiatives were created. Best remembered would be the Big M ads on television.
Milk will never be the same now the Big M's here. There's a big strawberry M, big strawberry M, and a big chocolate M, big chocolate M, big banana M. If you like it yellow, or if you prefer a big iced coffee M, get one right now from your nearest Big M's fella. Ooh, baby milk, ooh, Big M.
In the 10 years leading up to 1980, 1/3 of dairy farmers left the industry. New markets were sought in Asia, with Japan becoming a significant customer. Cheese became a major export along with milk powder. Through the late 1960s and into the 70s, Murray Goulburn emerged as a larger scale operator through cooperative amalgamations. By the 1980s, all the dairy factories in the Glenelg Shire had been closed down by Murray Goulburn, and all milk processing centralised in Koroit. It was a severe blow to employment in the smaller towns.
In the early 70s, Merino was just a bustling place. A Saturday morning, you couldn't find a place to park your tanker to go into the shop to get a drink. And by the mid-80s, all that had gone.
You got the busy season, springtime, about 16 people at Conda, plus they had the contractors with the trucks and carting and everything. It was a fair flow back. People didn't sort of... Plus the bank here in Conda, they used to bank here at Conda. You take 16 people out of Conda for employment is a fair gap in the workforce.
With milk prices declining in real terms and costs rising, ever larger acreages and herds were required to remain viable.
If you didn't increase your acreage per se every 4 or 5 years, you were actually going backwards.
As farmgate milk prices failed to keep pace with inflation and ever more infrastructure was required, dairymen gradually left the industry. From some hundreds of dairy farms in the Shire in the 1950s to just 50 odd today. This has been most evident in the northern part of the Shire, where the lower rainfall renders the land more marginal for dairying.
You go into a 20 kilometre radius of here, yeah, you'd probably come up with about 8 dairy farms. And originally, yeah, it definitely would have been there 100 odd plus, no worries at all. The cost of production after that, and yeah, and then the stainless steel and bulk fats, yeah, it just did change the outlook a lot. So the detriment of likes of little places of Coleraine, Merino, Digby, Sanford, all relied on the dairy farm, I suppose. Yeah, they've lost their workforce and lost, well, you lose that, you lose your bank, you lose the general store, and yeah, everything deteriorates.
The districts have all changed, haven't they? Nobody around, or no cricket teams or tennis teams, but see, the likes of us are partly to blame, because we've bought out not everybody, but a few farms, and those people gone, and there's nobody living there anymore. And you get 2 or 3 people doing that, and then they close the schools, and then that's all changed, you see. It's just not the people there. When we went to Cashmore first, with our 4 kids, I think there was 20, or Shane wasn't going, 3 kids. I think it was 23 there. And when they closed, I think it was 7.
In the past 130 years of the industrialised dairy industry, the only constant has been change, which still marches on. Greater mechanisation, sophistication of technology, and even the introduction of robotics have entered all facets of the milk production chain, from fodder conservation through to the consumer, and it shows no sign of letting up soon.
Well, looking back, if I had my life over again, looking back, I'd do the same. Because I enjoyed it, and I was doing it myself. I wasn't doing it for somebody telling me to do it. I was doing it how I wanted to do it, and that's how I done it. And
oh, when we started, there was places we'd have to walk half a mile, a good half mile. Had no tracks in. One farmer he used to drag his milk out onto the main road on a sledge. Well, he wasn't there with the horse and cart to cart us in. We had to walk in and walk back out, you know. And you're thinking, geez, well, the next farmer's wondering where the hell I am. Yeah. Yeah. Now there's some and distances between farms at times. You know, you go from Branksome and Wallasdale, and your next farm's down Tirrandurra, and all along gravel tracks.
Jock was a master of his trade. Like, at the end of his time, he would have inseminated more cows in this area than possibly any other artificial inseminator in Western Victoria. The number, you would probably have to go back and see Jock, but there is a magical figure as to how many inseminations he did in his lifetime round here. The people closer to Melbourne, the people in the northeast and around Shepparton, didn't have to do the travelling to inseminate so many cows. But Jock's dedication to his job around this area would, if they hand out plaques, he would have to get an OBE for the work he put into the local area around here. But he could manage anything. Like he used to manage the pub when the publican went away, so he could do both.
The best time to think was the day I finished dairying.
Oh, they were good days.
Well, we made a living, put it that way.
It's just so different. Fencing is all pine posts, and drive every post. You have to lift something big strain of post and dig holes, and hay carting is, nobody carts hay anymore. It's just a pull the lever job. Yeah, I just can't believe it really, how things have changed. I wouldn't mind starting again now, really.
We just loved the horses and that, yeah. We knew, we can still remember the names of the horses, you know, in the team and that, driving the draft horses and that, out to cart the wood and that, in the wagon and that, and to do the ploughing and so on. You could drive them without reins and that sort of thing, you know, just talk to them all the time, talk to the horses. They knew what you wanted to do. Big draft horses. We used to have to stand on the box to put the collar on them and that, magnificent life and that, yeah.
I think farming, if you enjoy farming and you enjoy breeding cattle, yeah, and you don't worry about how many hours you work because you're not getting paid the right rate per hour, farming can be very enjoyable to a lot of people in Australia.
Well, I wouldn't be dairy farm again.
Just loved the lifestyle. I loved the animals. My wife was very lucky in it. She loved rearing the calves.
The farming community, a great mob, but the ones that don't get any praise and the ones that I admire for what they did are the wives, the farmers' wives. When butterfat and everything felt low and a slump in farming, and the farmer went to work on the wharf with the Forestry Commission, or they said they were working on the forest and they said they were working on the wharf, but the wives would get the kids to school and milk the cows, draft some out for me, and do all this, you know, and they never got any praise at all. And they were, I've seen guys come in, farmers come in, and they'd be in the pub, and about 5 or 6 o'clock they said, well, better get home now, the missus will be finished milking. You know, boy, geez, those women did a great job. The women were the backbone of the farming. Yeah, they did a great job.